Hi, friends. You probably, if you've just joined the channel or you've only been on the channel for a little while, you probably don't know much about me. I'm not a journalist. I'm just somebody who cares about imperialism and cares about ending wars, and I also care greatly about veganism, the ending of the use of animals. And there's other social justice issues that I'm interested in as well. But they're the main ones, particularly veganism and anti-war, anti-imperialism are very important to me. And I'm pretty much a newbie at a lot of this because it's a bit of a learning curve for me because I'm from Australia and we don't really have. We've just been fed mainstream gruel basically for the last, all my life, and there is no sort of really independent news to speak of that actually gives the real story about what's really happening with the US and the wars and the national security state and so on. So, so I've been kind of fed this sort of mainstream nonsense for a long time, and then I came across Abby Martin's Breaking the Set, and also Democracy Now!, although Democracy Now! Has problems, but I started watching Breaking the Set in 2013 with Abby Martin, and then I realized that pretty much everything I knew was just nonsense and propaganda, really, and that certainly opened my eyes. And so I tend to, defer to people who actually know what they're talking about, like people like Abby Martin and Max Blumenthal and all of that. I don't pretend for a moment to be any sort of journalist or any sort of expert on anything. I really just am just a citizen who cares about my own country and cares about other countries on the planet. I suppose you could call it an internationalist in that I don't think of ourselves here as more important than any other country, any other people in any other country on the planet. And that's why, and I hope that everybody starts to just ignore these so-called borders and the nationalism and patriotism that is promoted in their own country and start seeing us all as connected and that our struggles are all connected. And so as I say, I sort of, it's a learning curve for me. And I was watching A Very Heavy Agenda. That's the YouTube channel by Robbie Martin, and Robbie Martin does a show program with Abby Martin. They are brothers and sisters, called Media Roots Radio. And Abby Martin, of course, is the journalist I refer to regularly. And Robbie Martin has started doing live streams from his channel, A Very Heavy Agenda, which is the title of the various documentaries that he's been bringing out. I think there's a part 4 coming out. That's very interesting for anybody who wants to see, is interested in politics and wants to see how the national security state sort of transforms through various individuals and the sort of the imperialist wars that come out of that. That's probably not a very good explanation about A Very Heavy Agenda, but anyway, you can go and check that out on Robbie Martin's site. But anyway, he was talking. He did a live stream yesterday and today. Today was very interesting on Iran, and yesterday was on was actually about Tulsi Gabbard and her anti-interventionist, her non-interventionist stance on various countries, and Robbie was analysing her position on that, and I wanted to just pick out some points that Robbie made and just give my own thoughts about it. And so he was talking about how Tulsi Gabbard sort of talks about the war on terror. She's very committed to the war on terror, and that's in many ways why she got involved in the military after the attacks on 9/11. And Robbie Martin was saying how we should reject the premise of the quote-unquote war on terror. And he was saying how Tulsi Gabbard never says she is against war in general. She's really says she's against regime change wars. And he was saying how you can't decouple the two. He says that Tulsi Gabbard has a reductive regime change wars narrative, and it's a gross oversimplification and is extremely narrow it's extremely narrow, and it appeals to both sides, like Trump supporters and everybody else. And, that's what it appears she's trying to do in this 2020 race, this presidential race. And he's not implying that she's some sort of stealth right-winger but she's definitely in some ways playing it safe with this sort of narrative. Because the regime change wars, really, the Iraq and Afghanistan, all this regime changing, you can include Iraq and Afghanistan in that. It's not like they're separate from that. And Pompeo and all these others always infuse this war on terror into everything. They're even doing that in relation to Venezuela, that there's terrorist groups in that. So, and that narrative started with the 9/11 attacks. So Tulsi Gabbard is an active National Guard personnel. She's part of the National Guard still, and that's an interesting thing that she's in that still when she's running for president. She says she enjoys doing it. And it's interesting that it's something to contemplate whether she doesn't speak very openly about what her experience is when she went to Iraq twice, on two different tours, I think, at least. And it's one has to wonder if she doesn't criticize the military because and isn't very open about her experiences because she doesn't want to criticize the military because she's still actively involved in the National Guard. I don't know, but it's interesting, and she could have an excellent opportunity to talk about this when we think about, say, Mike Preisner and how he's an Iraq vet. He has the podcast, Eyes Left podcast, and he speaks very openly about his experiences in Iraq. And it would be very beneficial if Tulsi Gabbard did that as well, but I don't know whether she's not allowed to criticize the military when she's in the National Guard still. I don't know. Robbie talked about how Tulsi Gabbard glosses over Israel. Now that's something that I've also talked about on this channel, that Tulsi Gabbard doesn't really talk about Israel. She glosses over it. She doesn't really, and nobody really presses her on it either, which is sort of interesting. Even Glenn Greenwald, I saw an interview lately with Glenn Greenwald, and I thought for sure he would ask her about Israel, but no, he focused on the usual thing that people tend to focus on, which is her interactions, her relationship with Modi, the Prime Minister of India. But I would have thought that, something like Israel, somebody would have pushed her on that to find out if she became President of the United States, would she continue to fund with military aid, $10.5 million a day of military aid to Israel, which allows them to continue on the brutal occupation of Palestinians. Her excuse for that, her rationale for not picking out Israel, she says, is because she doesn't like to single out any one country. And that's sort of interesting because she does single out a country, and that is she singles out Saudi Arabia. And it's become quite popular now ever since the Khashoggi, which seems to have opened the gates for people to feel like they can criticize Saudi Arabia, the brutal monarchy there. So she does single out individual countries. So that's not quite true, what she's saying about not wanting to single out Israel. And like I've said, I feel like she flies under the radar of that. And I hope that somebody at some point, some interviewer will actually push her on that, because I don't know why people are just ignoring that. Because for me, if somebody is okay continuing on the funding, the military aid of $10.5 million a day to Israel, an apartheid state, that should be a deal breaker. It should be a deal breaker. And you've probably seen I've done a video about what will happen when the DNC steals the primary from Bernie Sanders again. And I imagine at that point Tulsi Gabbard will be his VP, his choice for VP. What are they both going to do when the DNC once again steals the primary from Bernie Sanders? And And I've heard Cindy Sheehan say, well, he's going to do what he did last time, which is just relinquish it, just submit, and he's going to promote whoever the DNC has selected, which will be Joe Biden probably, or Kamala Harris. That's probably what's going to happen, sadly. But anyway, so Robbie was talking about how Tulsi Gabbard seems to have a rather a childlike, oversimplified view of the war on terror. And, he was saying how one cannot fight a tactic, that you can't fight terror. Terrorism is designed to be, is unpreventable, really. It's like you can't, and it's also, it can happen anywhere. Look at the attacks on in Sri Lanka on the Christian churches. So it's sort of like this whole idea that of wanting to be involved in the war on terror is sort of like it's sort of a dangerous position, because it's never ending. And as Robbie Martin was saying, you can't fight a tactic, you can't really fight an ideology. And so that position she has is quite problematic, particularly when she wants to continue using drones, and she thinks that you can do tactical strikes on people. Well, that's very clear that you can't do tactical strikes. You can't do strikes that don't involve killing a lot of civilians. And if you've seen some of the leaked information from Daniel Hale, the whistleblower, who's recently been arrested, he was saying how they don't differentiate. If anybody is standing with somebody who is they see as somebody they want to get rid of, they just drone everybody that's involved in that group. They just make this blanket assumption that everybody that person is talking to and relating to are also terrorists. And that's the other problem that I was talking about the other day. This assassination from the sky without trial business is just outrageous. I mean, everybody should be outraged at this, because can you imagine if, say, imagine if the situation was reversed and, say, Yemen was flying drones over the United States and just droning people in the streets, or the building that they lived in, killing everybody in the building, and just assuming that every single person that is in their company at the time, or has been in their company at certain times, that they're all terrorists, in quotes, and all need to be assassinated. That's basically what this drone program is. It's just outrageous, and it's sort of a, this would not be tolerated in the United States. If Yemen was flying drones over the United States, it would not be tolerated, and yet the US is flying drones over Yemen and just killing people in funeral processions and wedding parties, and doing double tap strikes where people that go to help them are killed. And imagine if, say, Afghanistan Afghanistan was flying drones over the United States and just assassinating people all over the place, including all their families and whatnot. I mean, this is truly, as somebody who's not an American citizen, and someone who hasn't been raised with that constant sort of thing of, like a lot of Americans have really, really ingested that narrative of American exceptionalism, of being exceptional above and beyond all other countries, and that whatever they do is good, and whatever, all that goes with this sort of American exceptionalism. I haven't been raised that way, so I think that, it's literally, I did a video about a week ago, it's literally in the DNA almost of a lot of US citizens that this imperialist sort of, that it's okay to go and invade countries, and for humanitarian reasons, in quote, or for resources. It's just sort of, or whatever the government is doing, that's okay, because they must be doing it for the good of those other poor countries that don't know how to manage themselves. They're just in chaos, they're sort of primitive, in quotes. This is sort of almost in the DNA of a lot of US citizens, and because it is almost in the DNA, because they've been indoctrinated so heavily to sort of think that way. I mean, look at the Pledge of Allegiance they do every morning. It's like a religion. Well, because of that, there's so few actually call out when these things are going on, when they're happening. I mean, look at what's happened in Venezuela right now. 40,000 Venezuelans have been killed through crippling U.S. sanctions, and there's hardly been a blip on the radar of most Americans. 40,000 Venezuelans through crippling U.S. sanctions. The media, of course, doesn't talk about it because they're just stenographers and they just promote the government narrative, the CIA narrative, etc. But even when some U.S. citizens find out, sometimes the most I'll see on social media, these little sad emoticons underneath things, as if that's some sort of activism. Putting little sad emojis on things. That's seen, for goodness sake, there has to be more response than just than little social media emojis. This is 40,000 Venezuelans have died, and there'll be a lot more dying through these crippling U.S. sanctions. And Juan Guaido has actually asked the European Union to put more sanctions on Venezuela. This is the person that claims they care about the people of Venezuela. He cares about the light-skinned people of Venezuela, the ones that are wealthy. He doesn't care about the mostly black, mostly dark-skinned population. This is a class war in Venezuela. So he doesn't care if tens of thousands more Venezuelans die because of crippling U.S. sanctions. He's a traitor to his country. Really, he is. He's been inviting the U.S. empire in to do a military invasion of his country. His little coup failed. He's a bumbling idiot, and his coup failed, military coup failed, and now he wants the U.S. to step it up. So, and why I bring this up is because, and this is something I totally agree with Robbie Martin. Somebody said in his live stream that the Americans need to reclaim the 9/11 mindset. That before the 9/11 thing happened, people need to reclaim whatever mindset they had, which wasn't this fear and scared of being bombed and whatnot from terrorists. And this is the other thing about this whole terrorism thing, is that it's always associated with Muslims and Islam and Arabs. It's a completely sort of a racist thing. And when Tulsi Gabbard talks about introducing an act to stop funding terrorists, that word terrorist is always associated with Muslims and with Arabs and the religion Islam. And there's really been virtually nothing that has happened on the U.S. soil. That's something that the U.S. citizens don't have to deal with, is the blowback that happens because of all the dreadful things that their government is doing. You don't get people bombing. The U.S. always does these awful things in other people's countries and gets other countries to fight to be a proxy and do proxy wars for them. But there isn't any sort of real. U.S. citizens haven't had to deal with other countries bombing their country and so forth. But this word terrorism, and this is what Robbie Martin was saying, and I totally agree, has to be decoupled. And it has to be decoupled from Islam and from Muslims and from Arabs. It has to be removed from that because they're so closely infused together. They're sort of associated with each other. And I also put quotes in around the words insurgent too, because that's an insurgent to one country like the U.S. is a freedom fighter to somebody else. There's all these words. There are all these words that are loaded, and they have a lot of meaning. And terrorism and terrorists is something, and I agree with Robbie Martin, that needs to be decoupled from, just completely attaching it to Islam and Muslims and Arabs. So, Robbie Martin was saying, there's no legitimacy with the war on terror. There is no legitimacy. And this whole thing that Saudi Arabia is responsible for 9/11, whatever. I mean, this has been going on for, if you read Max Blumenthal's The Management of Savagery, it's been going on, working up to 9/11 for a long time. And also the Bush administration had all sorts of indications that this 9/11 attack was going to happen, and they ignored it. And they've used that 9/11 thing to basically invade countries and for oil and for hegemony, and to basically sort of manage chaos in the Middle East. But, this whole thing that Tulsi Gabbard says about fighting the war on terror, well, you can't fight an ideology, and it's a sort of a ridiculous notion. And Robbie Martin was saying the real evil that needs to be defeated, and I totally agree with this, because I see it very clearly on social media. I've seen it very clearly for many years now, just not being a U.S. citizen and not being indoctrinated to this, indoctrinated every single day, and in some ways falling asleep to what the government is doing. But he said that the real evil that needs to be defeated is the imperialist, narcissistic mindset Americans have, and also the U.S. need for hegemony, because he says it's far more dangerous than any ideology like Wahhabism. And he does not subscribe to a false reality that was constructed for us by the Bush administration, and that all evil emanates from Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism. Well, that's true, and I totally agree with that about this mindset, because it's terrible to say this, but I see this so often on social media. This imperialist mindset, it's like people just default. A lot of US citizens just default to this sort of, we need to go in and do that. We need to invade that country. We need to throw that particular leader out. Even though they're democratically elected, it doesn't matter to some US citizens. They just sort of have this sort of an arrogance that this is totally acceptable to talk this way, and that these countries have no agency of their own, like the citizens in these countries have no agency of their own. They talk about them, and Trump in particular, when you hear about how he talks about Iran at the moment, which is looking very much like they're going to invade Iran, and they've already created a false flag. I don't believe those tankers that were attacked, I don't believe that was done by Iranians. I mean, and talk about the coincidence of timing. This is sort of a false flag that there's probably going to be another false flag that's going to be really disastrous. And they don't even need excuses anymore to invade countries. So I feel like that's quite possible they could invade Iran. I hope that they don't, because that's going to be a massive disaster for everybody, which could escalate into something dreadful. But Iran has been in the crosshairs of these people, of Pompeo for a while, and Bolton for a long time. And Trump, he's a warmonger, and he could stop it, but of course I think he's allowed this to go on for too long. And I think it has its own propulsion now, its own machinations, and that it could quite easily end up a disaster. But the thing is, what I was saying about Trump and the way he, this mindset, this imperialist mindset, Trump talks about other countries that aren't Western, like their children, this really patronizing sort of way of talking about them. It's really quite awful to listen to. It's so racist and patronizing. And that is part of that mindset, that any countries that haven't submitted to the US or that are not Western are somehow primitive, they're sort of incompetent, they're like children that you need to scold. I mean, the way he talks to leaders of these countries, like scolding them like they're children. And I've often said that, and I've heard, I think it was Chris Hedges, that it's actually a sort of a state religion. People go on that, religious, wars, people who are, waging wars and that are religious are more problematic. Well, I think that a sort of a state religion, which is sort of a American exceptionalism and imperialism, that sort of notion that we have the right to go into those countries and overthrow their democratically elected governments and install our own and take their resources. all of that. That is what's driving most of the violence in the world today. And these are, nobody goes on about the Christian fascists that are in government right now, in the U.S. government. I mean, Pompeo he believes in the rapture. You don't hear people slamming all of Christianity when you have these Christian fascists talking like they do and invading countries. And there are a lot of Christian fascists involved in these imperialist wars. And there are a lot of Christian fascists, there are a lot of so-called Christians in quotes, who applaud these wars and want them to happen. It's so far from Christian. And the same with anybody who's involved and pretends that they're Muslim and that they're killing people or whatever. That's not Islam. That's not that's not Islam. And sort of, so we don't go blaming all Christians for the likes of Eric Prince, who's a war criminal, or Pat Robertson, or any of those sort of right-wing, very, very unfortunate so-called Christians that are on television and that are quite happy to kill quite happy for war to start in countries, and they don't care about the carnage, but they're always carrying on about they're always anti-choice. They're always trying to make what's going on in Georgia now, trying to prevent women from having agency over their own body. So this whole BS pro-life thing that a lot of these pretend Christians go on about, they don't care about the wars. They like having power and control over women and women's bodies, but they don't care about the carnage of war. And Robbie was talking about how, it's not about the 28 pages that pointed to Saudi Arabia, the 28 redacted pages. It's actually the Bush administration ignoring so many signs that 9/11 was about to take place, and also how the US was lied to about the war on terror. And so he sort of asked the question, why does Tulsi Gabbard say that Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11? And that's what the Bush administration told everybody. But as Robbie pointed out, the Bush administration lied about it. They ignored all the signs. They could have prevented it. And now we have this ongoing war after war after war. So I also find it odd when she says things like Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11. It's so reductive. It's so sort of oversimplification of something. And it also, it sort of avoids any blame of the national security state, which is all to blame for what's been going on. And like I said, that Management of Savagery by Max Blumenthal describes how this has been going on since the 80s with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and how they were supported and funded by the US, and that it sort of went on from there. Anyway, I'm not going to explain it, but if you check out the book, it's really great. I'm still reading it, but it goes through everything that happens and sort of puts it all together so well, and you can clearly see how all of this and what happened on 9/11, all of that and what's happening up until now has particularly started back in that time where the CIA was funding and supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Russians, So, I mean, it's truly it's a jigsaw puzzle that comes together very well in that book. And something that I just want to return to, and I hope that I'm not pretending to be explaining what Robbie Martin said. I'm just making comments myself on what he was talking about on this live stream, and I'll post a link to that live stream. I'm not going to talk about everything that he talked about. It was a rather long live stream, but it's worthwhile checking out. And he did say Tulsi Gabbard was talking to Glenn Greenwald, and she said that we need to keep our country safe from Al-Qaeda that attacked us on 9/11. That always makes me cringe when I hear her say that. And statistically, Robbie said, the chances of being attacked by terrorists are lower than being struck by lightning. So the idea that we need to do anything in foreign policy to quote unquote protect ourselves from ISIS or Al Qaeda, he said, is obscenely illogical. and she doesn't explain how we should be fighting these people. What kind of quote-unquote war on terror does Tulsi Gabbard want to wage? Is it an ideological war? Teach people a different ideology? Teach people a different ideology, or spread a less extreme ideology? How can you subscribe to defeating ISIS with military force when one knows the cost of these regime change wars? So that's true. I mean, to me that makes no sense when she says things like, we have to defeat Al-Qaeda or protect ourselves from Al-Qaeda. I mean, seriously. And that's where it then sort of it sort of connects with her position about drones and droning people. Because how do you even... Al-Qaeda doesn't have a base. ISIS doesn't really have a base. Anybody can sort of call themselves Al-Qaeda. Anybody can call themselves ISIS, really. Sometimes I think ISIS actually claims to do things that they don't really do, but they can if they want to. And by the way, ISIS kills lots of Muslims. This is something that people don't realize. ISIS is quite fine with killing Muslims. It's not some sort of ideological war between Islam and Christianity. There's a lot of Christians that think that. But ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. It's got everything to do with, there's a whole context to that. And Barack Obama's even talked about how, they created a vacuum in Iraq and whatever. They've created vacuums, and this is how these various groups happen. They come out of this terrible carnage and destruction of these countries in the Middle East. Anyhow, I'll wrap it up here. There's a lot more he talked about on there, and I think it's worth checking out. I probably sort of made a bit of a mess, sort of massacred some of the things. I don't ever claim that that I always write on anything, or that sometimes I also make mistakes. But I do my best I just give my own personal opinion about how I think things are progressing, or I speculate. I'm not a journalist, so I can speculate as much as I want. But I do find that there's a lot wanting with the sort of, I appreciate Tulsi Gabbard as an anti-war candidate, and this isn't a dumping on her. I think people should be able to handle a criticism of any candidate, because they're not heroes. They shouldn't be put on a pedestal. They're actually public servants. And I'm not sure, I think it could be part of this celebrity culture that happens in the United States in particular, where anybody who's in a public light and has sort of some sort of popularity tends to be they get these sort of rabid supporters that will not allow you to question anything they say and think that you're trying to tear everything down or something like that. If you don't have... we obviously do not have a healthy fourth estate. We have pretty much a dead fourth estate, except for some independent journalists, and I mention them regularly on this channel. But we have to also question these individuals who are running for various leadership positions. And the US is the most powerful country in the world, and it rules by a might makes right, basically. We've all suffered in some way because of US empire. If you're not living in the US, if you're living in the US, you're suffering great poverty. A lot of people are suffering this widespread poverty, widespread homelessness. There's no proper health care and so forth in one of the most richest countries in the world. And a lot of politicians don't know anything about modern monetary theory, and look at the hashtag #LearnMMT. MMT is simply a description of the operational reality of a sovereign economy. That's all I'm going to say about it, but look into it. Stephanie Kelton is Bernie Sanders' 2020 economic advisor. She was his 2016 economic advisor. Please look into Dr. Stephanie Kelton and what she says about the sovereign economy, or what she says about the deficit, or what she says about federal job guarantee versus the universal basic income, and so forth. It's really important that people understand that. And we need to understand that federal taxes in a sovereign economy do not fund spending. So we don't need to tax the rich to be able to afford free healthcare or free education or elimination of student debt and so forth. We can actually do it because the sovereign economy is a currency issuer, and federal taxes do not fund any of those programs. They're necessary. It's necessary to tax the rich for ethical reasons, but we do not need rich people's taxes to be able to afford Medicare, free healthcare, and so forth. So that's why it's so important to look into that issue of MMT. It's not a theory. It's not something that needs to be implemented. The government, any sovereign government, is using the economy right now for purposes that are not to do with people, but to do with usually corporations and war. And they could do exactly the same. It's not an either or. It's a currency issuer, and they could be providing free healthcare and free public education and all of that right now, but they choose not to. So that's why it's so important to look into MMT. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about MMT. Anyway, check out Robbie Martin's channel, A Very Heavy Agenda. The thing that bothers me about these various candidates, putting aside that the DNC is not going to let any progressive get through the primary, okay? Anybody who looks remotely progressive, they're not going to let them get through the primary. And I really don't think that Bernie Sanders is going to challenge them if they do it again to him, steal the primary from him. I don't think so. But, maybe he will. Who knows? It might be a shock, and maybe he will. But he probably won't, which means that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be the ones that run. And Trump has got a lot of ammunition now due to all this Russiagate nonsense, a lot of ammunition, and I think he's going to use it, and he's also got a lot of ammunition against the Democratic Party. There's a lot of problems right now. There's a lot of lies and corruption has gone on in the Democratic Party, and I think he'll probably use that. He'll wield that like a weapon, and he'll probably end up getting in 2020. And then he'll see that as a mandate to wind back everything that was good for minority groups, and he'll escalate the wars. And if he hasn't already invaded Iran by the time the election comes around, which I'm sure they're trying to do, but if he hasn't, he'll certainly do it afterwards. So the Democratic Party is really to blame if he gets in 2020. And also, there's so many problems with the electoral system in the United States. For all the pointing of fingers that they do at Venezuela and all of that, the U.S. has a very, very dysfunctional electoral system. Remote hacking of machines, voting machines, and there's just a long list of problems. Anyway, check out Robbie Martin's A Very Heavy Agenda, his YouTube channel, and I think he's going to be doing more live streams. One more thing I was just going to say is that I just sort of feel like the candidates that are there are really wanting on foreign policy, and in some ways I don't really believe that they are. Even George Bush said that he was against interventionist wars, and look what he did. And then Barack Obama, I don't think he promised that, but he escalated 2 wars to 7, and Trump has been totally on board with the warmongering. It's a national security state. It's the common theme through all of this. And so the Democrats would rather have a Republican win in state elections or even in this presidential election than have a progressive at the head of their party. That's the bottom line, really. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. So please subscribe if you like the content. Please click the notifications bell, otherwise you don't receive updates. And please hit the like button and leave comments if you wish. I always enjoy your comments. So thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time. Bye for now.